Hello, and welcome to our May edition of Voices for the West, a monthly webinar series brought to you by Advocates for the West. My name is Will Shoemaker, and I am Communications and Engagement Director at Advocates for the West. For those new to us, Advocates for the West is a nonprofit public interest environmental law firm. We provide free legal services to conservation groups, Native American tribes, and concerned citizens in all 11 Western states. The title of tonight's webinar is Say It, Don't Spray It, Bringing APHIS's Rangeland Pesticides Program into the Light. We will be discussing the work of Advocates for the West and our partners at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation to protect pollinators, other insects, and sensitive species. We are challenging a program under the Federal Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, that allows pesticide spraying on millions of acres across 17 Western states. Lorianne Bird from the Center for Biological Diversity is unfortunately unable to join us this evening, but the center is also a partner in this work. And we are grateful to be joined by Sharon Selvaggio of the Xerces Society and Advocates for the West's own staff attorney, Hannah Goldblatt. If you are new to Voices for the West, first off, we welcome you. And second, I want to cover a few housekeeping items before we dive into tonight's talks. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a section labeled chat. It is customary during our Voices for the West webinars for me to request something of you, our attendees, so that we can better get to know one another this evening before we get started. So the question that I have for you is, I see some of you have already beat me to this in letting us know where you're located tonight. But for those of you who haven't, if you would take a minute and drop into the chat your location plus 2 words describing how you are this evening. And I will go ahead and drop into the chat now myself that I'm joining from Colorado, and I am quite pollen allergic this evening. My apologies if I start sneezing. The flowers are beautiful, but they certainly are affecting me. It's fitting, I suppose, that we're going to be discussing pollinators tonight. You will remain on mute throughout the course of tonight's presentation. However, we do welcome your questions. If a question comes to mind at any point during tonight's talks, feel free to go ahead and drop it into the Q&A section, which is also located at the bottom of your screen. It is different from the chat, and we will get to as many of those questions as time allows toward the end of tonight's webinar. Let's see. We have folks joining us from upstate New York, from Nampa, Idaho, from Roselle, Illinois. Others are blessed and grateful from Twin Falls, Idaho. Very tired. I hear you there. It's been a long day. But thank you all for joining us this evening. Our first presenter is Sharon Selvaggio, who is pesticide program specialist at the Xerces Society. Before coming to Xerces, Sharon's experience includes 27 years for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Forest Service as a National Wildlife Refuge Manager, conservation planner, and wildlife biologist. Sharon, I will turn the floor over to you as I pull up our slides here.
Okay, well, thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for being here. I am here to talk about why we are challenging the USDA APHIS grasshopper suppression program, or what we call the Rangelands Pesticide Program, in court. And I want to begin by saying thank you to Advocates for hosting this webinar and allowing us to take our concerns and our messages to a broader audience. I also want to thank advocates, and especially Hannah and Andrew and Lizzie, for the incredible legal support as we've developed this case and worked on it for the last couple of years. Also, the Center for Biological Diversity, for their brainpower in all of this. We wouldn't be able to articulate our case without organizations like advocates in the center. And just as importantly, we at Xerces wouldn't be able to even begin doing this work without the foundations and members who support us. So a huge thanks to all those generous organizations and individuals and foundations who give so generously to Xerces. And I want to preface my remarks tonight by noting that it is actually very rare for Xerces to enter into lawsuits. We prefer to, and usually do, work collaboratively with a wide range of partners, including agencies, federal agencies, state agencies. But there are times when programs are so egregiously harmful, when they're poorly run and so unresponsive to the concerns that we've brought up, that we have to take our case to the courts. And so that's what we did this time, and I'll explain why. Next slide. So to begin, I really want to acknowledge that there is no question that certain species of grasshoppers, especially locusts, have been feared by people for millennia. You probably know about the Old Testament, or maybe you've read the Little House books about the American pioneer period. And if so, you could probably understand an almost primal dread of grasshoppers, even if you've never experienced an outbreak yourself. Next slide. So the USDA APHIS it's an agency under the US Department of Agriculture, and they have the statutory authority to protect, control and suppress grasshoppers and lemon crickets under the Plant Protection Act. This is something that the federal government has had authority for since the 1930s, when outbreaks were particularly bad. You probably remember hearing about the Dust Bowl and all of that. And grasshoppers were part of all of that. Now, APHIS only has authority to treat rangelands, i.e. areas where livestock are allowed to graze or range. APHIS doesn't have authority to treat croplands, except as a minor component of the grasshopper suppression program. And I find this interesting because until the 1950s, and I think indeed until today, the concern was to protect crops, which are certainly higher value. So it's also interesting because in its PR photos and tours, APHIS almost exclusively highlights photos of grasshoppers on crops, not rangeland. But let's talk about rangeland, because that is what the law gives APHIS the power to do, is to treat and suppress grasshoppers and worm and crickets on rangeland. I have two photos here showing two very different kinds of rangeland. And as these photos show, they're really wildly variable in the way that they can present. They are native grasslands and shrublands. And in the West, these areas have probably never been under the plow. And you can see from the map, rangelands that are colored in orange, and they are concentrated in the Western states. And we also have public lands that are also concentrated in the Western states. I'm sorry, I think I messed that up, and the rangelands are in gray. You can see that there are some rangelands in the east of the 90th meridian or 95th meridian, but mostly they're in the west. Next slide. Now, you know, I've heard people say they've driven across the country and it's like, wow, get me out of Eastern Oregon. You know, they find it boring. Rangelands can present as barren, as uninteresting, compared to forest landscapes. But when you look closely, they harbor amazing biodiversity. And for example, on the left image here, you see the number of native bee species present by color. There is somewhere between 200 and 1,100 bee species present across the West, depending upon what part of the West you're in, typically around 600. The diversity goes up as you move further south. And as you can see on the right, and maybe that's not so, surprising, because you can see all the flowers mixed into that landscape. So rangelands are made up of grasses, but also a lot of flowering plants, which mostly rely on animal pollinators so that they can reproduce. And these flowering plants, also called forbs, are also food for cattle above and beyond grasses. And there have been some estimates that they can be like 30 to 80% of cattle diets. Next slide. So when APHIS sets out to kill grasshoppers, it mostly uses planes, like you can see here in the photo on the right. The pesticide is applied as a very fine mist. It's not unlike aerial mosquito applications, which are also applied often by plane with a very fine mist. APHIS oversees enormous spray programs. In some years, like 1985, they sprayed 14 million acres with very highly toxic insecticides. That was a very big year, typically less than this. There's an average of about 250,000 acres sprayed annually. The map on the left is zoomed into Montana and Wyoming, where the bulk of the spraying has occurred. What we're showing on this map are the areas that we know have been sprayed under the APHIS program between 2008 and 2021, or that were set out as contract solicitations, I should say, and that we were actually able to get this information, which is not easy to get otherwise, which is one of the issues I'll bring up later. So you can see from the map how large and continuous some of the spray areas are. Next slide. 2021 happened to be an outbreak year that was notable. And in that year, APHIS planned to spray insecticides originally across 2.6 million acres in Montana alone. And in the two counties that are shown here, Powder River and Custer, the footprint of the planned sprays was 1.2 million acres in just these two counties. That is more than the area of Rhode Island. Now, we understand that some land managers or owners backed out at the last minute that year, but we don't know exactly where because APHIS won't share that information with us. So the footprint we know overall ended up being about 1.3 million acres across Montana in 2021, according to statements, public statements that APHIS has made. Some of these proposed sprays were butted up against sensitive areas, including wilderness study areas. And in the past, we have seen APHIS treat occasionally national wildlife refuges and wilderness study areas. Next slide. Planes and pilots are expensive. So APHIS usually prefers to treat using planes because it's a lot quicker that way. But when they treat using planes, they require that a block be at least 10,000 acres. But usually we see blocks, especially in places like Eastern Montana and Eastern Wyoming, that are way larger. Frequently we see blocks that are somewhere between 35,000 to 250,000 acres. We saw a block that was very close to 1 million acres originally in Montana in 2021. So these are a couple of maps that we've been able to find through contract solicitations online. And you can see how in some portions of the unit that's shown on the left, whole townships are included. If you're familiar with townships, that's 36 square miles. So one of our concerns is that these areas are so large that insects essentially, which usually have pretty small home ranges, they just don't have anywhere to go to get out of the way. So this exacerbates the effect of the insecticides, not only because the insects can't get away, but because when they're applied aerially, there's a lot of drift. And they will drift from sites, quite a ways sometimes. And so when you have a checkerboard pattern, like what you see on the right, you can basically have a footprint that could be quite a bit larger than the official treated acres. And when we see treatments that are butted up against sensitive lands like national wildlife refuges or wilderness study areas, as they have been and sometimes are within those areas, that's a problem. Next slide. So let's go down to sort of the basics and think about the ecology of grasshoppers on Western rangelands. We are conditioned to think of grasshoppers solely as pests, but that really is not the full story. when you look around the world, and not just in the US, grasshoppers are actually the dominant herbivorous insect species in steppe and grassland ecosystems, which occur on pretty much every continent. And in the Western United States, we have more than 400 different grasshopper species. Now, the outbreaks that we heard about that happened in the pioneer period, in the late 1800s, those were very notable, and they were caused mainly by a locust species called the Rocky Mountain locust. Incredibly, this species actually went extinct with the last living specimen being collected in 1902. And it's the experience with that particular species that really laid the groundwork for the government to get involved with grasshopper control. And ultimately for it to be under the responsibility and purview of APHIS. But a very important point that I'd like you to understand is that most grasshoppers that reside in American Western rangelands never increase dramatically in population. There's only 1 to 2 dozen that do so, and they only rise in population under some conditions. The outbreaks tend to cycle, with major outbreaks seen every 5 to 10 years in some areas, but we haven't seen the kind of numbers and devastation that occurred in the pioneer area, and that may be because of that species having gone extinct. I think a couple of important points is that these non-damaging species, which are more numerous in the number of species, they coexist with these pest species. And some researchers believe that they keep damaging species in check through competition. As Dave Branson said in one of his papers, he's a leading grasshopper researcher with the Agricultural Research Service. The overwhelming majority of grasshoppers killed in control programs are not causing the problem and may be beneficial. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the subsequent slides. Next slide. So beneficial, how can that be? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that grasshoppers may actually increase rangeland productivity by speeding up nutrient cycling. This happens when grasshoppers feed on and digest plants that otherwise take a longer time to decompose in an arid environment. You can think about some of those plants that are really tough, that don't have a lot of water in them. And when they're fed upon and they move through an animal's digestive system, they break down, turn back into soil more quickly, and then the nutrients get released. It's kind of like a slow burn, and it can result in a flush of abundant new growth. Belovsky, another grasshopper scientist who sort of articulated what was going on here, said that grassland ecosystem functioning may be dependent not only upon the presence of grasshoppers, but their abundance. Next slide. Another function that grasshoppers play is that they are large, juicy, abundant arthropods. And when I say grasshopper, I should have said this in the beginning, but I'm just using that as a catch-all term to also refer to the Mormon cricket, which is also a target of the APHIS program. But these large, juicy insects are major prey for birds. Some of you may have heard, maybe many of you haven't, I don't know, but there's a story that the Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints people, tell about losing or nearly losing their first year's crop to an outbreak of Mormon crickets. According to the story, seagulls ended up swooping in, and they ended the outbreak when they were desperate and really thought that that was going to be the end. And so there've been studies, in our time in Western North Dakota and elsewhere that shows that bird predation is a really important natural regulator of grasshopper populations. And bird predation just on its own commonly reduces grasshopper densities on rangelands anywhere between 30 to 50%. There's 200 plus bird species that consume grasshoppers, and several of the grasshoppers that are important consumers in the West that most depend upon grasshoppers are actually experiencing declining populations, including, as shown here, the Swainson's hawk, sage thrasher, greater sage-grouse, and the western meadowlark. Now, birds are not the only ones that help regulate and control grasshoppers, that consume grasshoppers or prey or parasitize upon them in one way or another. You can see in the bottom row that I have spiders, blister beetles, nematodes, and flies shown. These are a few of the many non-vertebrate species that make their living off the grasshopper largesse as well, either through direct predation, such as a spider. Flies are also predators, or some beetles, or through disease, or in other cases, parasitism, which all of this means that these important organisms help keep grasshopper and worm and cricket populations from rising. But an important thing to realize is that these invertebrates that are shown at the bottom, not nematodes, but the others, they have the same kind of neural systems and exoskeletons as grasshoppers, meaning they're also vulnerable to the effects of the insecticides that APHIS uses. So if we hurt the base of natural enemies, there's the risk of actually exacerbating the problem. And some scientists have presented evidence that this has actually caused grasshopper outbreaks to be more likely and longer where control efforts have been more aggressive. Next slide. Right now, APHIS primarily is either actively using or planning to use 3 insecticide active ingredients. They actually have a 4th, but I don't think they've used that for almost 2 decades. I won't go into a lot of detail about this, except to say that they're all broad spectrum, which means that they kill a wide variety of insects. And maybe even more importantly, at the rates used by APHIS, we expect risk to bees, butterflies, and many other insects from these chemicals. But unfortunately, APHIS understates the results of models and key studies and tells the public that there's no problem, that only grasshoppers are really going to be the ones that are really going to be affected by these. And we don't see that that is true from the studies that we've looked at. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit about some of the insects that occur on rangelands that we're concerned about. We have a lot of pollinators, as I mentioned, both bees and butterflies and other insects. And many of these are actually at risk. We know that many of them are experiencing declining populations. So for example, the monarch butterfly, the Western population of the monarch butterfly is down to a very small fraction of what it once was. It's actually being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And based upon their general habitat needs, essentially, milkweed, Western rangelands could be supporting a lot of monarchs. The areas in the orange are particularly promising areas that have good habitat. But some of these areas coincide with areas likely to be treated for grasshoppers. Now, APHIS completely left out any toxicity information for butterflies in its environmental assessments, even the most recent ones where it is moving forward with its plan to use a new chemical, chlorantraniliprole, which was the one on the right in the last slide. That particular chemical we're really worried about when it comes to butterflies, because it's considered by industry, who tests these and figures everything out before they ever go to EPA, that these are very, very good at killing butterfly and moth caterpillars. So that would mean monarch caterpillars. And there have been studies directly on monarchs that show that they are very vulnerable to chlorantraniliprole at low levels. But none of this is mentioned or analyzed in the APHIS documents. Next slide. Similarly, we have a lot of at-risk bees. We know the most about bumblebees. The bumblebees that are listed and shown here inhabit Western rangelands, and they are all at risk because all of them have declined dramatically in population. You can see in the sort of orange at the bottom, that like the American bumblebee is only 12% as abundant as historically. The Western bumblebee, only 28% as abundant as historically. Both of these have been petitioned for listing, but the others are also much diminished. And there's other bumblebees that are not shown on this slide, such as Bombus sucklei and Bombus morrisonii, also in decline. They overlap the areas where these sprays can occur. But even with these legally binding, petitions and ecologically concerning developments that are affecting bees from multiple factors, not just sprays. APHIS doesn't mention these species in its EAs at all. And what I consider even more serious and damningly, that APHIS left out or misrepresented the conclusions of key studies showing harm at very low levels from the main pesticide it has been using, diflubenzuron, to bumblebees. These studies show significant impacts to reproduction, which means that if you can't reproduce, your population is eventually going to shrink. And this is not something that we want for our native bumblebees, which are already at risk and showing declining populations. Next slide. In most of the EAs, APHIS also left out this study, which is the largest, sort of most robust field study that was ever done on diflubenzuron, which is the main chemical that's used for the last 20 years. This was a study done by the US Geological Survey. Those of you who are scientists know that they do very premier science, very high quality science. So this study that was done in 2008 looked at an actual APHIS aerial diflubenzuron treatment, and they looked at both short-term effects and lag effects, basically effects after a year. And what they found is that there were significant effects to a whole different, many different orders of insects, both short-term and long-term. Those that are in bright red show populations that were significantly lower in the short term on the column on the left, and the two columns in the center and on the right. The bright red shows significantly lower after a year's time. The sort of pinkish color, not quite as bright red, but more of a pink, shows that there were fewer, it wasn't at the statistically significant level, but still of concern. So you can really see the broad impact on many, many different orders of insects, many of which are really important. Beetles are important for so many functions. They break down dung, they're predators, they're food. Grasshoppers, of course, are, important for the reasons that I discussed before. Bees and wasps for pollination and for pest control. Flies, many flies are also predators on many different other insects. They're really important groups of, they are a really important group of insects. Spiders also affected, scorpions, and even Lepidoptera. Fewer, although not quite at the statistically significant level. This was with diflubenzuron, which is as I said, the insecticide that APHIS has been preferring over the last 20 years, but they're moving toward an insecticide that is going to be much more dangerous for Lepidoptera. So if this study was repeated in the future with that chemical, we could see different results, but they're both broad spectrum, which means they kill a wide variety of insects. Next slide. Oh, I just want to mention too that, when we think about the risks of the program to such a broad variety of different kinds of insects, this really comes into focus when we consider that 230 different species are listed under the Endangered Species Act, residing in the areas that could be sprayed under this program. And many, if not most, of these listed species actually rely on insects for food or for pollination or for other services. And some of the listed species are insects themselves. So let's talk just a little bit about how we benefit from wild insects, just in pure dollar terms. This was an interesting study that was done a few years ago, but I've updated the numbers so that we can think about it in today's dollars. We often don't think about wild insects in terms of their economic value to us as people. But in this paper that was done by one of our biologists, Mace Vaughn, and a colleague of his at a university, LOCI, their annual contribution to the US economy is $70 billion each year in 2020 dollars. Really quick to cover, they only looked at 4 functions, and one of them was dung burial, which is really important on rangelands because cow patties, they take up a lot of room. And there've been many studies that show that if those cow patties don't break down, they basically smother the vegetation and you reduce the amount of forage that's going to come up, so making sure basically having this free ecosystem service of animals that are actually breaking down the dung, recycling it so that plants can grow again is really important in Western rangelands. And every rancher knows this species, the dung beetle. It's really important. Pest control, as I mentioned before, really important. This is another ecological service that can be framed within, for dollars and cents. Pollination. And lastly, wildlife nutrition, or basically just the food that other wildlife species get from having insects around that they can eat. I would guess that this is really an underestimate of what the value really is, because we're not even talking about other things that we really can't measure that insects provide us. Next slide. So I'll just finish up with a couple last things. We have a lot of other concerns, and Hannah's going to go over some of these in a little bit more detail, I think. But we've noted that APHIS has demonstrated a real lack of transparency, a lack of site-specific analysis, and a lot of science glossed over. We also don't see that they have taken the time and the effort to demonstrate that in the areas that we treat, we actually have an economically damaging population. It's very broad brush, the numbers that they use. There are ways to do this and they just don't. I mentioned this before, but specially designated land is generally not off limits and some has been treated. And I also mentioned this, but we are concerned that their treatments may actually increase the severity and frequency of grasshopper outbreaks, as has been demonstrated in some studies. So finally, next slide, I want to say that, our long-term goal here is really to support and have a commitment with all of our federal agencies, land managers, and APHIS toward rangeland health. Considering grasshoppers as part of that, we're talking native species. And what does that mean? We want to see that there are strategies that maintain the ecosystem productivity, that conserve natural enemies and the natural processes that have always existed on rangelands, and avoid impacts from suppression efforts. We consider this as a much more sustainable approach to rangeland health. Won't be easy, but it's definitely worthwhile. So I am going to pass it over to Hannah. I just want to say thank you again for being here and learning about this. And at Xerces, we rely on donations. We're also a nonprofit. And so if you're interested in supporting our organization, you can go to our website and help us to do this work. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. As a reminder, real quick, if you do have any questions throughout the course of tonight's talks, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will cover as many of those as time allows toward the end of this evening's webinar. Our next presenter is Advocates for the West staff attorney, Hannah Goldblatt. Hannah works out of our Portland, Oregon office. She first worked at Advocates for the West in the summer of 2019 as a law clerk before joining the team in October 2021 as a staff attorney. Since then, she has defended numerous special places and imperiled species, from southern mountain caribou to pollinators to sage-grouse. Hannah.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Sharon. It's always really wonderful to get to follow Sharon because her depth of knowledge on these issues just really highlights how strong the science is informing this lawsuit. And so now I'm going to talk about our litigation against APHIS and its rangeland pesticides program. Next slide, please, Will. So the Rangeland Pesticides Program is administered by APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which is an arm of the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. It gets the authority for this program under the Plant Protection Act, which is quite a misleading name for this statute, given what it authorizes APHIS to do. The program is intended to control grasshoppers and Mormon crickets to protect rangeland, as Sharon mentioned. And under this program, APHIS is actually authorized to treat private and state lands as well, if necessary, to protect federal rangeland. And it allows the agency to immediately treat lands once grasshopper levels have reached a level of economic infestation. And it must get a request from the land manager, which is usually the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, or the United States Forest Service if on federal land, or the state agricultural department if on state land. And it must get these requests before doing any pesticide treatments. And this program is very widespread. It's carried out in 17 Western states, so it has an enormous scope. And I'll talk a little bit about how our lawsuit addresses the program as a whole with implications in all states, but also how we're focusing in on a few states where things are particularly bad. Next slide, please, Will. So just a brief overview on our concerns. Sharon did a great job of talking about all of the issues with this program, and now I'm sort of going to talk about how those issues inform our legal claims. So the four main issues that inform our lawsuit are this lack of transparency with the program. We and our advocates and our clients have had to submit numerous requests under the Freedom of Information Act to even find out where pesticide treatments have occurred in these areas. We've had to go through thousands of documents to have any sense of specific areas where pesticides have been applied, because APHIS does not readily publish this information to the public. In its environmental documents, it doesn't include maps, and it basically makes it really hard for the public to find out where spraying has occurred and where it might occur in the future. There's also issues with a lack of site-specific environmental analysis, insufficient attention to the risk to non-target species and sensitive areas, especially native pollinators. And then this just pesticide-heavy approach to carrying out this program, and just really lack of consideration of more holistic measures to address these pest issues, specifically integrated pest management. Next slide, please. So our legal tools to address these problems are first and foremost the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And this statute helps us get at this lack of transparency issue, as well as APHIS's inadequate look at the environmental impacts of its program. Additionally, the Endangered Species Act is implicated here because the lands that APHIS sprays on are also habitat to species that are listed as threatened and endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So because of that, APHIS has various obligations under the Endangered Species Act to ensure that its actions don't harm those species. And then finally, the Administrative Procedure Act, or APA, provides a sort of overarching tool that allows us to challenge the inconsistency of APHIS's program with various authorizing statutes. And I'll talk about all of these in more detail with respect to our lawsuit and claims. Next slide, please. Okay, so this lawsuit is challenging several agency decisions, and I'm going to sort of explain how they interact with each other, because it helps inform APHIS's errors and the nature of our lawsuit. So first is this 2019 programmatic environmental impact statement. And this 2019 programmatic EIS reauthorized this pesticides program across all 17 Western states. The previous EIS was in 2002, and this EIS reauthorized the program and sort of took a general look at the environmental impacts. And I'll talk about the flaws with that in just a moment. But so that's the underlying decision document that applies to all the states. And then that document says that APHIS will conduct further site-specific environmental analysis on a state level. So in each of the states that it operates its program on. And these state-level environmental assessments, which are supposed to be the site-specific analyses, are typically issued every year or every few years and cover pesticide treatments in an entire state or in a large region within the state. And our lawsuit is focusing on 4 of those state-level documents in Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And we narrowed in on those documents, on those states, because these are states where spraying has been particularly bad. As Sharon mentioned, in Montana in 2021, over 1 million acres were impacted by this program. And in Oregon and Idaho, there are issues with sage-grouse in the areas where treatments have occurred. And we've also found out through our FOIA requests that sensitive areas like wildlife refuges and wilderness study areas have been treated in these 4 states. And so that's what our lawsuit's focusing on, but importantly, the implications of our lawsuit extend to the entire program, given that we're challenging this programmatic document as well. And also because the state level documents are very similar to each other. It's sort of a template across each state that is just adapted for each state in not very significant ways. Next slide, please. Okay, so to the say it portion of the title of this Voices for the West, I'm going to talk about our claims under NEPA. So NEPA, for those of you who are not familiar with the statute, is one of our touchstone environmental laws, and it has 2 main purposes. One is that agencies must carefully consider the environmental impacts before it undertakes a decision. And the second, which is related to that, is that there must be a meaningful opportunity for public participation and necessarily public disclosure. And this occurs through public notice and comment. With this program, APHIS really failed at both of these major pillars of NEPA. And I'm going to talk about the various issues that are raised under our NEPA claims in this case. So first is APHIS's failure to consider a less pesticide-intensive alternative for the program. NEPA requires agencies to consider reasonable alternatives for its programs. And in the case of APHIS's rangeland pesticides program, in the 2019 environmental document, it only considered pesticide alternatives for addressing grasshopper outbreaks. Despite the fact that in the 80s, APHIS actually chose an alternative for the program that took a more holistic approach, including preventative measures and biological controls. But then in 2002, APHIS basically took a 180 with its position and claimed that basically it lacked authority to do anything other than apply pesticides. And notably on that prior document, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, actually commented critiquing APHIS's decision to not consider non-pesticide measures for addressing grasshoppers. In 2019, APHIS did the same thing, choosing a pesticide-heavy approach. Second is APHIS's inadequate examination of the impacts of its program on non-target species and sensitive areas. And NEPA requires agencies to look at the direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of its actions. And here, APHIS's program just really fails to do a meaningful job at any of those analyses. It really just, for example, for cumulative effects, despite the fact that other pesticides are applied in these areas, APHIS basically throws up its hands and says that it doesn't have the ability to analyze those cumulative effects and they'll be negligible anyway. But cumulative pesticide use is very concerning for these species that are, many of which are already at risk, as Sharon talked about in depth. Along with this is APHIS relies on various mitigation measures to claim that effects will be minimal or not rise to the level of incredibly concerning. And there are huge problems with the mitigation measures that APHIS relies on. For example, as Sharon also mentioned, APHIS implements these buffers that are supposed to protect water bodies and sensitive species. But yet we've learned through our review of FOIA documents that pesticides do actually drift beyond these buffers sometimes when they're airily applied. And so these mitigation measures do not seem adequately protective for non-target species. Similarly, APHIS basically doesn't even acknowledge that pesticide use has occurred in sensitive areas, despite the fact that these areas contain a host of biodiversity and sensitive species and are incredibly ecologically important. And just again, as to the cumulative effects point, like for one example, the Oregon state legislature appropriated $5 million for grasshopper control over the next couple years, yet APHIS doesn't even mention this in its environmental documents, despite its obligations to analyze cumulative effects. Next is APHIS's inadequate site-specific analysis. So as I mentioned, APHIS has these state-level documents that are supposed to be the site-specific analysis. Yet these documents are written in incredibly general terms that basically just describe a broad region. APHIS refuses to consider where pesticides were sprayed in the past, despite the fact that we know that areas that have experienced outbreaks in the past are often ones that experience outbreaks in the future. Yet it doesn't do a close analysis of the impacts to these areas. It only analyzes the impacts in very general regional terms, which is not adequate under NEPA. And then finally is just this lack of transparency, which ties into that former point. The public just does not have enough information about where pesticide use has occurred and will occur in the future. And this is troubling for a host of reasons, one of which is that we have learned that pesticide spraying also occurs in popular recreation areas, such as the Steens Mountain area, which the Oregon Desert Trail intersects. So that's kind of an overview of our NEPA claims that are at issue in our lawsuit. Next slide, please. Next is this idea of don't spray it. So as I mentioned, APHIS has taken this bold stance that it only has authority to apply pesticides to address grasshopper problems. Yet we believe that two relevant statutes actually give APHIS the authority to consider more holistic measures, including integrated pest management and other preventative measures that would result in less pesticide use. So first is the authorizing statute for this program, the Plant Protection Act, which specifically calls out prevention. Yet APHIS essentially acts like this portion of the statute doesn't exist. Second is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. And this act actually says that federal agencies shall use integrated pest management techniques in carrying out pest management activities. So we're bringing a claim under the Administrative Procedure Act, arguing that APHIS had authority to implement non-pesticides measures and was required to consider such an alternative when authorizing this program. Next slide, please. And then finally is the Endangered Species Act. So as I mentioned, there's a host of endangered and threatened species that have habitat in the areas where this program occurs, including the northern Idaho ground squirrel pictured on this slide, as well as sensitive plant species like the Ute lady's tresses, other species like bull trout and the yellow-billed cuckoo. And many of these species actually occur in several states in which the program operates. And under the Endangered Species Act, Section 7A1, APHIS has an obligation to consult on the impacts of its program. And yet APHIS reauthorized its program in 2019 without completing a new programmatic biological opinion, considering the programmatic impacts. The most recent biological opinion was in 1995. And ever since then, APHIS has been doing these annual state-level consultations, informal consultations, that are basically these two-page documents that, that take a look at the impacts to species in these state areas. The problem with this, the problem with not completing a programmatic consultation is that APHIS is necessarily missing the sort of cumulative picture of the impacts to threatened and endangered species. It's easy to say, perhaps, that impacts may be negligible when you look at a seasonal basis in one state. But when forced to look at a multi-state level impact of this pesticide application, things could look a lot different, and APHIS was required to take that look when reauthorizing this program. And sort of on a practical level, the importance of this is to get consistent mitigation measure for these species, because what we've seen with these state level consultations is that species are not equally protected in different states. There's inconsistent mitigation measures depending on the state, such as different buffer sizes for the species. So we have a claim trying to get APHIS to reinitiate this programmatic consultation. Next slide, please. All right, so that was an overview of our claims, and now I'm just going to give a little update on where this case is at. So we filed this case last summer. We received the administrative record for the case this December. That's the record on which the case is evaluated in these administrative law cases. Upon our first review of the record, we felt that the record was very barren given the scope of this program. And so we ended up filing a motion to complete the administrative record to include various categories of documents that we believe APHIS unlawfully withheld from the records. First is deliberative materials, so draft documents, internal communications, and other like materials, which APHIS just wholesale excluded from the record. And then related to that is APHIS's failure to produce a privilege log explaining the reason for its withholding of these documents. This is sort of an interesting legal issue that is actually up on the Ninth Circuit right now and will be decided by the Ninth Circuit. So it's a little bit out of our hands in this case because it went up to the Ninth Circuit while we were briefing. So we expect that the Ninth Circuit will issue an opinion on that before we hear from the judge in our case. And then finally, APHIS failed to include basically any site-specific treatment information. Again, through our review of FOIA documents, we have seen maps of where treatments have occurred. We've seen detailed treatment records and reports, and none of that was in the records that we received for this case. And we believe that was wrongfully withheld. And so that is another issue that is before the court right now. After that's decided, we'll proceed to summary judgment briefing, which will decide the merits of this case. And that is it from me.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So we have some time for some questions, and we have some questions. So let's see here. The first question: many Western native grasslands have been lost as non-native cheatgrass has proliferated under overgrazing. How is this loss of native grasslands also affecting grasshoppers and other insects? Is that something we know much about?
Sharon, you're muted.
Sharon. Yep.
That's a really great question and a complicated question. I wish I could answer it well. I don't think that there is a simple answer. Basically, from what I understand is that, you know, the vegetation and its density and height and species composition can have multiple interrelated effects on grasshopper composition and density itself. And sometimes those work in opposite directions. Anyway, I can't give a very coherent or short answer to that, but I think that's part of the puzzle here. In some places we see that there have been studies that show that grasshoppers are more abundant in like crested wheatgrass areas, but again, it's complicated. Anyway, I'd love to talk to you about it. Maybe when we had some time, a little bit more time, Paul, if you'd like to get in touch outside of the webinar, that would be great.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that, since Paul's question was about cheatgrass. And we know that there's a lot of spraying for cheatgrass that's taking place on federal lands right now. What other spraying is occurring on these federal lands, and you know, whether it be herbicides or something else?
That's another really good question. And we do know that BLM has some fairly large and active herbicide spray programs to try to eradicate, and maybe that's not the word that they use, but to, you know, replace cheatgrass with native species. They actually have an EIS out right now. They're talking about changing up the herbicides that they'll allow. I've been actually looking lately just to see some of their contracts online and where they are. And what we know is that this is a pretty big program, you know. So in talking about the cumulative effects, which Hannah touched on, are there cumulative effects between the use of herbicides and the use of insecticides? Possibly, you know, we need to look in the literature and really understand that, but it's certainly not out of the question. And that is one of our concerns that we feel that APHIS hasn't adequately taken into account, because it has never considered the interaction between the pesticides it uses and other pesticides within the landscape, whether they be on BLM or public lands or on private lands. And we know that on private lands, there's a lot of different pesticides that are used, other insecticides, probably some fungicides, and certainly herbicides.
What do we know about impacts to neighbors, I guess I would say broadly, from the spraying that's occurring?
I could speak, or yeah, I can speak to that. I'll just say that in our review of, again, FOIA documents, because this information isn't otherwise readily available to the public, we've seen, for example, complaints from people who live in the vicinity of these sprays, who complain of pesticides being sprayed too near their property. And that type of complaint will then trigger APHIS to do testing. And we've seen in at least one case that despite implementing 1,000-foot buffers with private residents, APHIS tested that private residence and found pesticide residue along the property. So that indicates that the buffers APHIS is relying on to protect not only species, but the public are not protective enough. And that was just one example from our FOIA review.
I will say that in 2021, the Montana Organic Association submitted comments on the program, and they were concerned about drift onto their organic farms. They were concerned that APHIS didn't have adequate information about where all those organic farms are. And in Montana, the organic sector is really important for, I'm trying to remember if it's wheat and garbanzo beans and lentils, I think are some of the top organic crops. I think for lentils, they're #1 in the nation, and possibly for wheat. But in any case, that's another neighbor issue that has popped up that we know about.
We've talked about integrated pest management. Is it feasible? Can we do away with pesticides altogether and still manage grasshoppers and Mormon crickets? I mean, is that at all possible?
Well, I think, you know, that's a difficult question too. And, you know, it would be easy to be blithe about it and say, but of course we can, because that's the way nature has always done it. And yet when you consider within our cultural context and our, you know, it would be very difficult, I think, to completely give up pesticides just for social acceptance. But, you know, when we look at examples in China, for instance, I've seen a study where in China they did bird population restoration, partly through really focusing on habitat for birds, and saw a major decrease in locusts, which was one of the populations that they were struggling with, or one of the species. We know that there's a lot of interrelated factors, that there are rangeland vegetation, you know, management models that seem to reduce the density of grasshoppers. Twice over rotational grazing has been examined and really shown to be promising. That might not work in every year or in every place. We don't know yet, but we know that there are certainly some models out there that might be used. And we also know that there's non-pesticidal ways that people manage grasshoppers in the past. I was just reading today about how some of the early settlers managed Mormon crickets, which they don't fly, so they're a little bit easier to sort of drive, but there are ways to sort of encircle and drive some of these kinds of grasshoppers and Mormon crickets. And and actually have a pretty significant effect on localized populations. But again, I don't want to claim that there's a silver bullet, but there's certainly things that could be looked at and really should be looked at.
What determines the location of spraying? I think you both have answered this to some degree. And, I know, Hannah, you mentioned this, simply a request from a land manager. When that occurs, is there any, are we aware of any criteria that are applied, that it is being applied by APHIS to determine whether, one location is suitable and one is not? Or and I guess to add on to that, why is there spraying taking place in recreation areas and wildlife refuges? Like, why?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to go into depth about this, but I did mention how the statute actually requires there to be a level of economic infestation before APHIS treats. And APHIS basically describes what that means in pretty general terms, it does this balancing analysis to determine that there's an economic outbreak. We've seen in some documents that sometimes it equates, I believe it's anything over 8 grasshoppers in a square meter. Is that right, Sharon?
Square yard, yeah.
Square yard to be an economic infestation. But one of the other issues in our lawsuit is how APHIS actually analyzes that. And we didn't bring a claim specifically targeting its lack of doing that on a treatment level because of various sort of strategy reasons and just ease of bringing that type of claim. But we are trying to get at the idea that APHIS hasn't adequately explained how it does that analysis. And I'll just say that I haven't seen anything in the thousands of documents I've reviewed showing that APHIS really does a true economic analysis. And certainly to one of Sharon's slides, I think it should be considering the long-term economic impacts of pesticide spraying, but it seems like instead it's doing this sort of quick equation, like if there's X number of grasshoppers in a square yard, that'll authorize its treatments. And so, Will, to your second part of your question about recreation areas, that's just happening because that's where grasshoppers might occur in large numbers in a given season.
And I'll just add 2 things to that. One is that the 8 grasshoppers per square yard, which has been used for 40 or 50 years, was developed based upon adult grasshopper density. But nowadays, APHIS uses primarily diflubenzuron, which only works on juveniles. Well, the reality is that the landscape can accommodate a lot more juvenile grasshoppers, the nymphs, than it can the adults, because they eat a whole lot less. And just like lots of species, you see birds that have clutches of 12 little chicks, but only 6 of them survive or 2 of them survive. Same thing with grasshoppers because of all those natural enemies. But APHIS never has explained in its documents why 8 is still the appropriate number for nymphs. They're doing the nymph counts and actually doing the treatment at the nymph or juvenile stage. It's not appropriate, but they persist in talking about the 8 per square yard. And one other thing I want to say is that through the FOIAs, we have received some information about the costs of these grasshopper sprays. And when you think about federal lands where the taxpayer is basically being paid at $1.35 per AUM, or animal unit month, and you do the math to convert that into an acre based upon how many cattle that rangeland can support, this is a very heavily subsidized program, essentially. Sometimes these grasshopper treatments cost as much as $45 an acre. And we're only getting back literally pennies on the dollar on an average piece of rangeland in the United States. So the US taxpayer is basically subsidizing this program almost entirely. Something that I think all of us as taxpayers should be aware of. And think about, is this the kind of subsidy that we really want on our public lands when it poses so much risk to our native species?
Well, thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Hannah, for providing insight into this APHIS program and also potential alternatives that we could be advocating for in in pursuing a more ecologically responsible approach. And thank you to our attendees for your thoughtful questions. This important work to protect our environment and hold federal agencies accountable that groups like Advocates for the West and the Xerces Society is doing is made possible thanks to supporters like you who are with us this evening. If you feel inspired, we hope you will give a gift to help us continue this important work. I will be sending a follow-up email that includes a link to ways that you can support us, as well as a link to the recording of tonight's webinar on YouTube. Please feel free to share it with folks who you think might be interested in our work. It is almost summertime, which is an exceedingly busy time of year for many of us. And as a result of that, Voices for the West will be taking a break for a few months and will return in September. So stay tuned in the months ahead for our fall 2023 slate of webinars. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.